Hello, everybody. Michael, the librarian of magic here, finding and cataloging the magical and pointing you to it. I'm back to talk about the newest episode of the Clone Wars that premiered April 3rd, 2020. It's episode 7 of season 7, the final season, entitled Dangerous Debt. I'm just going to warn you, as I always do on these, in case you're just stumbling on this will be spoiler heavy. My Clone Wars videos especially are, my Star Wars videos especially are. So just know that going into it. And I assume that you have a lot of knowledge, at least about the show, The Clone Wars. I'll try to explain stuff as I go, but I'm not going to delve too deeply, just for the sake of time, into stuff that happened in the previous seasons. But I will try to mention things as much as I can. If you have questions about any of that stuff, feel free to drop a comment down below, and I'll do my best to answer questions about stuff that I may not be clear about or that I need to clarify further. So with all of that out of the way, I'm going to jump into episode 7, Dangerous Debt. This picks up where Ahsoka, Rafa, and Trace are imprisoned now by the Pikes. They were sucked back in by a tractor beam. They weren't able to escape Obadiah. They're now in prison down on the planet. They're all sharing a prison cell together, and Ahsoka and Rafa are arguing about how they got there in the first place. Ahsoka is contending that Rafa never should have took this job to begin with. And Rafa says, hey, look, if Trace never jettisoned the spice out into space, then we would have already made our delivery, and this would have been no big deal. She's kind of still being stubborn and prideful about the whole thing. Ahsoka points out that spice ruins people's lives, so delivering it would have been a net moral bad, and it really wouldn't have been a good idea to deliver it anyway. And Rafa gets kind of snarky and says, oh, we got a regular Jedi over here with her morals and all of that. And Ahsoka says, I might be a Jedi, you don't know. And then Rafa reacts badly to that, and she starts talking about how the Jedi are a sore spot, and then we find out a lot more about Trace and Rafa's backstory. We learn that the reasons why Rafa's not interested in having a morality lecture over and over again from Ahsoka, sounding like a Jedi. We learn that there was a Senate hostage situation, which this is events that took place way back in season 1 of the Clone Wars. And there was a breakout to try to rescue Zero the Hutt from prison on Coruscant. The Jedi pursued Zero during this prison break, and Zero was being aided by bounty hunter Cad Bane, who was like a guy with red eyes. And Rafa mentions this. A red-eyed alien shot down a transport ship he was protecting Zero. The Jedi tried to regain control of the transport ship, but they couldn't do it. And in an effort to get the transport ship to not hit a platform full of people, they steered it off in a different direction. It ended up hitting the other side of the platform, which is the home where the Martez family lived. Rafa and Trace's parents were able to get Rafa and Trace out in time, but they were both killed. They were both taken out in this. So the Jedi were basically confronted with, if you're familiar with philosophical queries, what's known as the trolley problem. Do you, if you have a device barreling down a track and you have to pull the switch to save one person or a bunch of people, what do you do? And that's essentially what happens here. Rafa then says she was confronted by a Jedi after her parents were killed, and they failed to capture Zero the Hutt anyway. He got away, so all of their stuff that they did was for naught anyway. And she said she was confronted by a female Jedi with green skin and dark robes, which we know from this other episode was Luminara Unduli. And she just tells her, the Force will be with you. And then she leaves, and they get no help from the Jedi. They get no assistance or anything like that. They're orphans, and their life is a wreck, and the Jedi have nothing to say to them about it. And so they grow up resenting the Jedi and also having to band together because they lost their parents and stuff. And that tells a lot about what motivates Rafa and Trace, but Rafa especially. So, yeah, that's kind of... We see a lot of that action in another episode. If you're interested in seeing that, go to Season 1 and check out an episode called Hostage Crisis. and that whole story arc in general, if you want to know about some of those events with Zero, the Hutt, and everything like that. It's not necessary to sort of get the gist of everything that's going on in this episode, but if you want to know exactly what they're talking about, that's the direction to go in. But so yeah, that explains everything. And then, after that whole speech, Rafa says, and I basically blame Ahsoka for the trouble that we're in now, because you keep pontificating about morals and everything, and I'm trying to figure out a way out of this. And Ahsoka feels bad for everything that happened with the Jedi when she learns that this is, what happened, and she apologizes. She apologizes for what happens. At that point, the Pike guards come into the cell and they grab Rafa out of there and take her out, because they're getting ready to torture her. They still want to know where the spice is or what happened to their money. So they're getting ready to torture Rafa. They hook her up into this chair, and she's about to be tortured by an 8D series smelter droid, which are kind of a cool thing. If you had ever been to Disney's Galaxy's Edge at Disneyland or Walt Disney World, or if you've seen any video footage about them or anything like that, they have an 8D series smelter droid at the restaurant Ronto Roasters. It's a full-size droid and everything that roasts the Ronto meat over a repurposed pod racing engine. So that's what an 8D smelter droid is. In this episode, the Pikes in this prison have repurposed this smelter droid as a torture droid. So he's about to try to electrocute Rafa. She tries to come up with some emergency lie about how, I think the Kessels, scammed me, and I don't know what happened to the spice, and she gets shocked by the droid. Back in the cell, Trace is talking to Ahsoka, and Trace confirms to Ahsoka, Rafa was telling the truth about what happened with our parents and the Jedi and everything like that. She's not a bad person. She's trying her best, but that's where we come from. We come from good people, stuff like that. Just giving a little more insight to Ahsoka of what's going on. The Pikes come back. With Rafa, she's worse for wear. She's basically unconscious. They chuck her in the cell, and they take Trace to get ready to torture her. Trace then, when they cut over to Trace, she gets ready to go to the torture chair, and she thinks quickly on her feet. She pretends to faint, and as she's doing so, it kind of throws the guards off for a moment, and that gives her enough time to knock out a guard and take the guard's blaster and start firing her way out of here. She starts shooting a couple of the guards, and then also creates a situation in which she's about to be attacked and electrocuted by the torture droid, and she gets in the way, gets a guard in between her and the droid, and the guard ends up being electrocuted. So there's kind of this cool action sequence. And Trace is starting to not be so green. She's starting to not be so naive, and she's learning how to think her way out of some of these situations. So she escapes the torture room. Meanwhile, back in the other cell, Rafa is basically unconscious, and Ahsoka uses the Force to open the cell when nobody is around. She rouses up Rafa and tells her, "Wake up, the cell's open." Rafa wants to know what happened. Instead of saying, "I opened it with the Force," of course she's not going to admit that she's a Jedi. She tells her, "I don't know, the power grid went down and this just opened up, so let's escape while we can." So they try getting out. We cut back to Trace. She's running through the prison, trying to go back on a rescue mission for the other two. She runs into some other guards and again thinks quickly on her feet, gets some help from some other prisoners as well that she lets out of a cell, and dispatches these guards. Eventually, the three meet up and they run into each other in this hallway. They have a brief little argument about which direction to go into, and Ahsoka eventually points them in a direction. And they go out through this door that leads them to an outdoor hangar bay situation. They move all these barrels out in front of the door so the guards can't chase them through, and then they duck behind a series of blocks to try to protect themselves. The guards come through and they start shooting at each other. Trace is the only one that has a weapon of any sort. She's reaching up and trying to shoot the guards. She shoots one of the barrels and it explodes and takes out all of these guards, and that's how they're able to get further away. As they're running along, Ahsoka turns around and uses the Force to knock down a series of blocks that help secure their path even further. They get to a spot where there's a bridge, and there's some other guards that come up behind them, and they push these buttons to start retracting the bridge. It's one of these things that comes apart at the middle. Rafa is able to jump over with just a little bit of help from Ahsoka, and as the gap is widening, Trace just says, look, I got to try for this, or else we're not going to get out of here. She jumps. She's going to be well short of making it, but Ahsoka uses the Force to push her forward, and she manages to grip onto the other side, and Rafa helps her up. At this point, they're trying to get Ahsoka to jump across, and Rafa mentions to Trace in an aside she's doubtful that Ahsoka will even make it because the gap is way too wide, and she's just like, she's not going to make it anyway. We might as well get out of here. But Trace says, no, I'm not leaving without Ahsoka. Ahsoka handily jumps over, mad Jedi jumping skills, and she actually lands behind them. And the girls think that she falls in, and they're like, where did she go? And then she's behind them, and they're like, wow, how did you get across? And she just says, I'm more athletic than you probably realize. So that's kind of a cool little moment. As they're running along, they start to have this conversation where a lot of this episode is about Rafa kind of slowly coming to grips with her bad decisions. And Ahsoka also coming to grips with, Rafa's not that bad of a person, but they've been forced to be in a bad situation. And some of that is because of the Jedi. And that dovetails in with how Ahsoka is wrestling with, the purpose of the Jedi Order and all that stuff, and how she used to be in it and now she's not anymore. So that's kind of interesting. They're having this conversation in which Rafa starts admitting it's weird that the Pikes would go to so much effort to even try to keep us from leaving here, trying to kill us just for a bum spice deal. And Ahsoka says, well, this is what happens when you do business with criminals. Rafa says, look, I'm just trying to make a living, and when you're trying to do that, when you're trying to just scratch by, you don't really consider, like, executions and torture and all of that stuff. Ahsoka then makes the point that if the Pikes were to let them off planet, they would lose reputation. They need to try to save reputation, which is one of the reasons why they're trying so hard to dispatch all of them. So they have this whole conversation. Then they get into a spot where they're kind of safe, but they need to get through this gate, and Rafa sends Ahsoka off to try to disable the gates. We'll distract the guards. You go up and disable the gate. She has to go up into this control tower. And there's a bunch more fighting on both sides. Ahsoka goes up to the tower, dispatches a bunch of guards. Rafa and Trace dispatch a bunch of guards on their end. And Ahsoka is able to get the gates open. Then when they come back down, or when Ahsoka comes back down, she has a little side conversation with Rafa as Trace is running up ahead, and says, look, I think that you're cut out for this sort of thing. Running and gunning, lying, dealing. Trace might not be cut out for this sort of thing, and you're dragging her into this over and over again. And Rafa says, if she's not cool with this, if she's not happy with this, she can say so, and I won't force her to be in any of these missions. To which Ahsoka points out to Rafa, do you really think she would say no to you? You're her older sister. She looks up to you. She's going to do whatever you tell her to do. And Rafa then goes back to the line of questioning of, what is in this for you? Why do you care so much about this? Why are you trying to help us? What is your angle? And Ahsoka just says, I am hardwired to help. That's just in my nature. It's who I am, and I'm just trying to help. In the midst of this conversation, they get approached by a beggar who asks them if they have any credits, and Rafa gives them the brush off. And she then turns to Ahsoka and says, I'm trying my best, and stuff like that. I know that you're annoyed with me, but we're trying to figure all this out. When Ahsoka says that she is just hardwired to help and that she's trying her best to be a good person and she has no angle, Rafa admits that reminds her of somebody, essentially referring to her own mother. And then as they are walking away, they go away to some other area. A couple of things happen. One, the beggar ends up bumping into some Pike guards as he's trying to figure out a way to get himself some credits, and he recognizes the three girls on their little holo finder thingy and points out that he knows where they are for a price. So he basically gives up their position here in a few minutes. Before that, as the girls get by to wherever it is they're headed next, they brush by a couple of Mandalorians that are in cloaks that are standing there. These Mandalorians are basically leftovers from the former Death Watch, and they're just a small little cadre led by Ursa Wren, who is a key player in previous seasons of the Clone Wars, as well as future seasons of Star Wars Rebels. And it's just kind of a cool design too to see these Mandalorians wearing Mandalorian helmets, but underneath cloaks in disguise. They just kind of look cool wandering around. But anyway, you see them briefly lurking around, and they have a little dialogue. At one point, the Trace, Rafa, and Ahsoka try to steal a land speeder, which is eventually crashed when the Pikes catch up with them after their position is revealed by the beggar. The Mandalorians see all this happen from a vantage point. When the land speeder is crashed, Rafa and Trace are taken by the Pikes, and Ahsoka manages to escape. They see her run off, and Ursa Wren, who I assume is Ursa Wren, recognizes Ahsoka and says we need to keep an eye on her and see where she's going and stuff like that. So she gets kind of spotted by these Mandalorians. They recognize her as a Jedi. Then they, Rafa and Trace get taken back to the Pike prison, and Ahsoka's not there yet. She tries to mount another little rescue op to get back into the prison, and essentially that fails. She tries to get in there, but the what's the guy's name? Marg Krim, who's the leader of the Pikes, is sort of ready for this. In this eventuality, he actually is using Rafa and Trace to lure Ahsoka in. He knew that she would come for them, and so he was ahead of her, basically, and her rescue attempt fails, and they capture her as well and throw her back in the cell. So the episode ends with the three back pretty much where they started, in a Pike prison cell. They try to reason with and make a deal with the Pikes and say, look, we're willing to do another mission for you if it makes up for whatever happened before. And they're like, why would I trust you after what happened? We want our situation to be rectified. Fife, the right-hand man of Grimm, wants them executed, basically. So that's essentially what's looking to be happening at the end of this episode, that they're probably on the chopping block to be executed. Because they're unable to reason with the Pikes. At which point, at the end of the episode, Rafa apologizes for getting them into this mess, for taking on this mission in the first place, and she finally owns up to her part in this whole mess. And we're getting somewhere with some character growth and something like that. Between Rafa and Ahsoka, especially, they're coming to understand each other, and Trace is growing as a person who's not so naive, not so green. So it has been interesting to see the three of these characters work together in this story arc. There's probably one more episode of this left. I'm assuming that it's obviously the story hasn't wrapped up yet, so we'll see where this heads next week when they release a new episode on the 10th of April. I will be here to talk about it and give you my impressions and thoughts about it, the way that I did with this. Thanks as always for watching these. I hope this was entertaining and informative. If you have any questions, or if there's things that I didn't delve into enough, or things you want to know about, or even things you might know about that I got wrong, any way you want to interact about that, please feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks as always for watching these. I hope that it was a nice little distraction for you, something interesting and fun to watch. So, yeah, thanks as always. I'll be back when they make another one of these episodes coming out next week. And until then, may the Force be with you. Take care of each other, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.